The wagons went in one at a time because that was the only way across. Ahead of them, the mud looked solid. It was not solid. It was tidal ground, the kind that holds a man's weight for a moment and then does not. And somewhere in the middle of it, in the space of maybe 20 minutes, the water came back faster than anyone in that column had planned for. By the time the last carts understood what was happening, the ones ahead of them were already gone. Not sunk in some dramatic instant, just gone, the way a dropped coin is gone in a lake, swallowed by ground that closed back over itself and left no mark. This was October 12, 16. The man giving the orders, from somewhere safely ahead of the crossing, was John, King of England. He was not being chased by an army in that exact moment. He was being chased by something slower and just as final. A civil war he had provoked. A group of his own barons who had turned on him so completely they had offered the English crown to a French prince, and a body that was already failing him from dysentery he had picked up weeks earlier. John crossed the Wash by the safer inland route, sensibly avoiding the tidal flats himself. His baggage train did not have that luxury, or that judgment. It went the direct way, across the estuary, carrying what medieval chroniclers described as his treasury. Crown, jewels, gold and silver plate, coin, the movable wealth of an English king who could not risk it falling into rebel hands. We know about this because two men wrote it down. Roger of Wendover, a chronicler at St. Albans, recorded that John lost his chapel possessions along with many baggage horses and much of his household stuff in the shifting quicksand and whirlpools of the estuary. Ralph of Coggeshall, writing separately, described something similar. Neither man was standing on that shoreline. Both were writing years later, working from second-hand report, in an age where chroniclers routinely shaped a king's death into a moral lesson. That matters because both of these writers despised John. Wendover, in particular, used his chronicle to paint John as a tyrant, and a king losing his own treasure to the earth itself, days before dying in agony, is exactly the kind of detail a hostile chronicler does not need to invent so much as lovingly preserve. So the honest question historians still argue over is not whether something was lost at the Wash. It probably was. It is how much. Some later medieval writers inflated the loss into the entire royal treasury, the crown jewels of England, gone in an afternoon. Modern historians are far more cautious. A king traveling through a war zone likely split his treasure and moved it by multiple routes, the way anyone protecting something valuable spreads the risk. The baggage train that went into the Wash may have carried an important portion of it. It almost certainly did not carry literally everything England's crown owned. What died alongside the confusion was any chance of clean documentation. There was no formal inventory taken at the scene because there could not be. The men who might have written one either drowned with the wagons or fled with what they had left. What survives is chronicle, not record. Memory shaped into narrative, written by people with an argument to make. 3 days later, at Newark Castle, John died. The dysentery that had been working through him for weeks finished the job. A king who had spent his reign losing territory, losing the trust of his barons, and now, according to the men writing his obituary, losing his own treasure to a stretch of English mudflat, died with striking narrative convenience for the people telling his story. History rarely hands you an ending that tidy. When it does, it is worth being suspicious of exactly how tidy it is. But suspicion about the chronicle does not make the mud less real. The Wash is a genuine tidal estuary between Norfolk and Lincolnshire, and in 1216 it was considerably more dangerous than it looks on a modern map. Its channels moved with every tide. Quicksand formed and dissolved in places with no warning. Crossing it directly, rather than going the long way around, was already a known gamble in the 13th century. Losing a baggage train there was entirely plausible. That is exactly why the story survived for 800 years instead of being dismissed. Here is the part that makes this loss different from almost any other treasure story. Most lost hoards are lost because nobody has looked hard enough or looked in the right spot yet. This one is different because the ground the searchers would need to stand on may not exist anymore, not in the form it had in 1216. The Wash has been shrinking for centuries. Land reclamation projects, beginning seriously from the 17th century onward, have pushed the coastline outward, draining and enclosing thousands of acres that used to be open estuary. Rivers were straightened. Silt that used to move freely settled and built up new ground. Villages that were once coastal are now several miles inland, sitting on land that used to be underwater. Which means the actual physical location where those wagons went under in 1216 might not be a stretch of tidal mud at all anymore. It might be a wheat field. It might be under a drainage ditch or a farm access road, or the foundations of a barn built 200 years after anyone stopped thinking to look there. The coastline that swallowed the treasure has, in a sense, swallowed the evidence of where it happened a second time. Searchers in the 20th century tried anyway. Amateur historians and treasure hunters combed contemporary maps against modern ordnance survey charts, trying to reconstruct where the medieval crossing point would have sat relative to today's shoreline. Metal detecting groups worked sections of reclaimed farmland near Sutton Bridge and Long Sutton, areas historically associated with the crossing. Geological surveys were floated. None of it produced anything resembling royal treasure, because none of it could answer the first and hardest question. Which centuries-old layer of silt, under which modern field, might still hold the 1216 ground surface at all? Some searches were abandoned for a simpler reason. Even where the general area is agreed on, nobody can say with confidence how many meters of accumulated silt now sit on top of whatever survived. Metal detectors have practical depth limits. Ground-penetrating radar works far better in controlled, shallow conditions than across miles of shifting agricultural wetland. The technology exists to search. The problem is, nobody can point to a spot small enough to justify the cost of a serious excavation. And so the story settled into folklore. It shows up in treasure hunting books, in regional legend, in the kind of local pub conversation where the crown jewels of England are always somewhere just under the next field over. Pop history often renders it as a straightforward heist of fate, a king who lost everything in one dramatic afternoon. The real picture is messier and, honestly, more interesting. A contested chronicle, a hostile pair of historians with their own reasons to exaggerate, a landscape that has been actively erasing its own crime scene for 8 centuries, and a scattering of amateur searches that all ran into the same wall. What almost certainly did not go into that estuary is a tidy pile of glittering crowns, exactly as later legend imagines them. A medieval royal treasury was as much administrative as decorative. Chests of coin, plate for the royal household, ceremonial and religious items from the king's traveling chapel, alongside whatever crown jewels John was keeping close during a war. Some of that was valuable beyond price. Much of it was simply valuable, full stop, the working wealth of a government that traveled with its king. Whatever the true scale, it is still down there, or it is nowhere at all, scattered and dissolved by 8 centuries of tide before land reclamation ever got the chance to bury it deeper. Nobody living can walk to the spot and point at it. The county has changed shape since it happened. That is the part of this story that outlasts every argument about how many wagons went under. A king who spent his reign grasping for control lost his own fortune to ground that no longer exists in the way it did the day he lost it. Was it the whole treasury, or a fraction the chroniclers inflated into legend? That argument will likely never close, and maybe that is the more honest ending than a number ever could be.